First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this very important workshop. As Professor Martin Grambov mentioned, the biotic pump concept was formulated by Viktor Gorshkov and myself, and now in our country we're working with Andrei Nefedov on developing it further. So I want to tell you about how the biotic pump can fit to the eco-restoration context, which, as we understand, is the main purpose of the projects that are being discussed in Tunisia and more broadly in Africa. So biotic pump is a process of how natural ecosystems regulate the atmospheric moisture transport, enhancing the water cycle on land. So in order to understand what is actually new in this concept, let us first take a brief look at how the role of vegetation and land processes was conceptualized before. So here we can see land and ocean, and the land, we know, receives moisture from the ocean in the form of water vapor. So there is moist air that arrives on land and it ascends over land, and then when moist air ascends, it cools, and so water vapor condenses and precipitates. So in order for there to be rain over land, moist air must ascend. So then we have precipitation, and liquid water returns to the ocean as runoff. And in more arid areas, like some regions in Africa, we do need both rain and the stream flow, because many people depend on stream flow on rivers, and so diminishing rivers would be a big problem. Now let us add evaporation from land. You can see these small arrows, they represent evaporation. So we add evaporation, and what happens? Now, as some moisture is returned back to the air, more moisture is now leaving the region in our simplified picture. And as far as not all moisture is now in the form of liquid, the most important effect of all this is the decline of stream flow. And that is why we can hear quite often that evaporation or evapotranspiration, when we speak about vegetation, steals water from rivers. And so there is a competition between people and plants for water. So this is simple moisture recycling, which means evaporation or evapotranspiration, adding moisture back to the atmosphere, always leads to a decline of stream flow, which is not good when we talk about a restoration of the water cycle in arid regions. So now let us look how the biotic pump changes this picture. So at a certain point in the history of life, natural ecosystems conquered land. And so the questions that we physicists were addressing in the first place, is there a physical process that these ecosystems, these living beings that were learning to live on land, could use to bring the water with them very far to the inner part of the continent? Is there such a physical process? So this process is actually condensation. And when we add natural ecosystems and we add evapotranspiration, you can see these red arrows here. What happens? When the atmosphere is sufficiently moist and we add even more moisture, there is intense condensation, there is a pressure drop, and a more intense air convergence. So compared to moisture recycling, what we are seeing is that due to the change in the dynamics of moist air, we can see a change in the airflow, in the air motion. And as condensation releases wind power, so under certain conditions, we can see that adding extra moisture to the atmosphere leads to enhanced inflow of moist air, and a result, an increased stream flow. So when we confine ourselves to moisture recycling and this biotic pump dynamics is absent, when we add vegetation and increase evapotranspiration, we have a decline of local stream flow. When we have the biotic pump dynamics in place, adding evapotranspiration, adding more green life leads to the enhancement of the import of atmospheric moisture and enhanced stream flow. So this is the scenario that is the most desirable one and the one that we are aiming at when we design an eco-restoration project. So what was our logic was as follows. If we can prove that this process of condensation generating sufficient wind power does indeed exist, then it would be natural to expect that in the course of hundreds of years of biological evolution, natural ecosystems could learn how to use it to their benefit. In the same manner as the living beings mastered the laws of aerodynamics and learned how to fly, for example. So most part of our work was not in ecology, but actually in atmospheric dynamics, where we had to show that the theory that describes how much wind power can be generated from condensation does indeed make sense and produces predictions that match the observations. And the main observations that made us confident in that the theory gets it right and that enabled us to withstand some originally hot discussions with colleagues who, as also Professor Martin Grambhoff mentioned, were not always agreeing, and this is natural. So the main lines of evidence was that the wind power in both global circulation and in smaller scale condensation phenomena like tropical cyclones very well conform to theoretical predictions. So you can estimate and predict wind power, and in the case of tropical cyclones, also wind speed from considering the condensation-induced atmospheric dynamics. So turning back to forests, what we also studied was so the question is how we can demonstrate that this effect is actually working in real forests. And to do so, we turned to continental scale distribution of precipitation, and what we especially in the boreal zone, because in the boreal zone you have these two seasons, one when the forest is dormant and we can expect that the biotic pump doesn't work, and another one when the forest is active, and we can compare these two regimes. And you can see here in the lower graph that indeed this is the distance from Atlantic Ocean from west to east, and this is the logarithm of the ratio of precipitation on land to precipitation over the ocean. And we can see that in summer this line precipitation is very uniformly distributed over land. This is 7,000 kilometers, while in spring, in winter, where the biotic pump doesn't work, we can see a decline in precipitation from west to east. And we can see here in Australia, the decline is the same independent of whether it is warm or cold or wet season or dry season. Another thing where we could find evidence that confirmed our theoretical and physical theory was the Amazon wet season puzzle. And this consists in the following. So if this is our globe and this is the precipitation depending on latitude, right? We can see there is a peak near the equator. So this peak goes north and south depending on the season, and it brings this depends on the processes in the ocean, and these peaks actually brings wet season to the corresponding latitude. But the puzzle with the Amazon is that here the wet season starts almost 2 months in advance of the arrival of this rain peak into tropical convergence zone. And this actually this early arrival of the wet season is preceded by an increase in evapotranspiration. You can see this black line, and a much higher increase in precipitation, which means that the moisture convergence, the net import of moisture also increases. And this also is accompanied by trees in the Amazon making new leaves in the late dry season. And this effect that confirms the biotic pump predictions or agrees with them was firmly established by an independent group of scientists. So we can see that if we look at soil moisture as the capital of the ecosystem, so then evapotranspiration can be seen as an investment that the ecosystem makes to get even more in return, such that it can compensate the inevitable losses of water to runoff. So this is another view to look at this. And what we were recently been exploring, and what we believe is most relevant to Africa, to arid and semi-arid regions, is how can we design the eco-restoration project such that we minimize the time that the ecosystem spends in the dry regime when more green life means less runoff, and how can we help it to go to the wet regime of the biotic pump functioning. So So it is very important that we are not stuck in the dry regime, but have a perspective of going to the wet regime. So what happens in terms of air circulation in the dry regime is that if we look at the air circulation, we can see that all evaporation that goes into the air that flows horizontally is then blown away from land. So land is losing moisture. So to conclude, the biotic pump brings good news that by restoring natural vegetation, we can intensify the stream flow, the availability of fresh water, and we are now developing it further to provide guidance on how to avoid being trapped in the regime when we decrease the stream flow by adding more green life. And this emphasizes the need for strategic interdisciplinary planning when we think about important eco-restoration projects, because just adding species of which we think could be good for our economy or whatever could actually not fit the complex eco-hydrological context of the territory and could worsen the situation rather than improve it. Thank you very much.